We're now at our final session of the day, which is really at the heart of our conference, which is very much from mansion to museum, looking at private philanthropy and public art. So I would like to invite my colleague Jasper Gaunt to in turn invite the speakers for this session. Over to you, Jasper.
Thank you, Armin, and thank you to all of our speakers for today's conference. And I've never been to a conference where the last session is running only 5 minutes late. As moderator, I've been instructed to remind everyone of the 20-minute rule. Our first speaker in this session on moving from the private mansions to the public museum is Suzanne Higgott, who's curator of glass, bronze painted enamels, earthenwares, and early furniture of the Wallace collection in London. These collections were acquired almost exclusively by Sir Richard Wallace, whose life and collecting activities Dr. Higgott has researched extensively. In 2006, she established the Wallace Collection Seminars on the History of Collecting, and in 2018, she organized the exhibition The Most Fortunate Man of His Day, Sir Richard Wallace, connoisseur, collector, and philanthropist of the Wallace Collection, this to coincide with the bicentenary of his birth. This year, she's involved in events celebrating the 150th anniversary of the installation of 107 so-called Wallace fountains for drinking water in Paris. Her publications include Sir Richard Wallace's Majolica, Sources and Display, 2003, a catalogue of glass and emotion painted enamels of the Wallace Collection, 2011, and numerous articles on aspects of collecting glass and Majolica and the role of women collectors in the 19th century. Her title today is Achieving Immortality in the Age of Calouste Gulbenkian, the Metamorphosis of British Private Collections into Public Palaces of Art. Suzanne.
Thank you very much. Well, hi everybody, and I'm really grateful to have been invited to speak at this conference, which has been absolutely fascinating so far. Calouste Gulbenkian's life coincided with a phenomenal period of philanthropic giving of art to the British public. 2 exhibitions in the 1850s were instrumental in initiating this period of munificence, which came to a close in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace in 1851 inspired an initiative to increase public access to art. The hugely successful Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, held in 1857, revealed to the public the remarkable holdings of art in British private collections. Governmental and societal changes also played a key part. The Museums Act of 1845 and the Museums and Libraries Act of 1850 paved the way for such philanthropy. The agricultural crisis of the 1870s and 80s was disastrous for the landed aristocracy, as we've heard from Jeremy. The passing of the Settled Land Act in 1882 enabled them to sell entailed property, releasing many fine works of art onto the market. Sir William Harcourt's budget of 1894 introduced a new death duty tax, but provided total tax exemption for bequests to national and local museums of items of, quote, national, scientific or historic interest, encouraging bequests from private collections. Wealthy collectors sought exclusivity in their lifetimes, not least when it enhanced their social status. Sir Richard Wallace lent more than 2,000 works of art to the opening exhibition at the Bethnal Green Museum in a poor area of East London from 1872 to 1875, on condition that the exhibition was dedicated exclusively to his collection. The exhibition was opened, as you see here, by no less a grandee than the Prince of Wales. Wallace's collection, which he'd inherited from his likely father, the 4th Marquess of Hertford, and which he continued to expand, gave him an entree to elite British society in spite of his illegitimacy, his French wife Lady Wallace's humble origins, and her disinclination to speak English, not to mention their son, who had been born out of wedlock, and Wallace naturalised 30 years later when he married the lady who became Lady Wallace, all of which were frowned upon by the British elite. Nothing could give major collectors greater exclusivity and philanthropic credit than founding a museum dedicated to their own collection and named for themselves or in memory of a family member. I'm going to talk about 6 of the greatest eponymous collections in Britain. 3 of them, the Wallace Collection, the Bowes Museum and Waddesdon Manor, which is pretty much eponymous as it's universally identified with the Rothschilds, have strong Anglo-French connections and associations with the landed nobility. The other 3 were assembled by industrialists who, through their commercial success, attained elite social status. They are the Lady Lever Art Gallery, the Ivy bequests Ken Wood, and the Burrell Collection. Lady Wallace, the Bowes, and others may have been motivated to create eponymous museums in part because they were childless, predeceased by their children, or had fallen out with their children and wished their art collection to be their legacy. For 19th century society may have disapproved of people divesting their children of their inheritance. William Cobbett, who died in 1835, wrote that, quote, "It is morally wrong for a man to divert his estate from his family." Oops. That was it. The young Calouste Gulbenkian took up residence in London in 1897, the year in which Lady Wallace bequeathed the Wallace Collection to the British nation. He was still resident there in 1900 and would have been aware of the fanfare that heralded the museum's opening that year. The Wallace Collection comprises more than 5,000 works of art, many of international renown, such as Howells's Laughing Cavalier and Fragonard's The Swing, both of which you see on the left here. It has an unrivaled collection of 18th century French paintings and decorative arts, superb holdings of princely European arms and armour, and a fine, wide-ranging collection of medieval and Renaissance works of art. Unlike the other institutions in this survey, nothing can be added to the Wallace Collection, so it remains an entirely unembellished reflection of the taste of the people who formed it, from the first to the 4th Marquesses of Hertford and Sir Richard Wallace. A friend of Wallace's wrote that he was, quote, determined to establish his principal residence at Hertford House, which is where the Wallace Collection is now housed, and to complete and rearrange the building so that it should not only be fitted for a private dwelling, but adapted for the Hertford Wallace Museum he wished to found. However, when the widowed Lady Wallace bequeathed the works of art on its ground and first floors to the nation, she didn't expect the collection to remain at Hertford House because she didn't own the freehold. But the committee set up to recommend a suitable location for the museum favoured its remaining there as, quote, it would, more than any other arrangement, preserve the distinctive character of the collection and would retain it within the building in which its owners had placed it and which they had adapted for its reception. And I just brought up this plan from the beginning of the period of transition from private house to public museum. Just to show you, bottom left, there is the Lady Wallace's boudoir, the couple's bedroom at the very west at the bottom, and then you're seeing galleries built on by Richard Wallace as well. So just to give you a sense of the flavour of the residential and the public spaces. In adapting the house, the trustees opted for a sense of grandeur, in line with trustee John Murray Scott's view that, quote, some alterations must be made, but I think it would be possible to preserve the cachet of a palace and yet adapt it for public exhibition. This slide and the next show 2 spaces, both in Wallace's time and after the museum opened. His 16th century room at the top here was originally half its present size, separated from the adjacent room by a wall and a door, which you see in that top image. To accommodate more Renaissance works of art in one gallery, the wall was removed when the building was converted into a museum. And below left, you can see a drawing of the proposal for creating a single room from the 2 rooms, marking the original division between the rooms with pilasters. And at the bottom right, you see the 16th century gallery as it was when the museum opened, with, instead of the pilasters, palatial columns marking the divide between the rooms. The trustees' desire to evoke a grand residence is also revealed by these photographs of the back state room in the Wallace's time on the left, and soon after the museum's opening on the right. The museum must have surprised and delighted early visitors accustomed to viewing art in a more austere institutional environment. At the Wallace collection, they viewed paintings alongside decorative arts objects in an interior that evoked the palatial aristocratic London houses of which it would become a rare survivor. Jonathan Conlin has observed that Gulbenkian was, quote, heavily influenced by the Wallace collection, by its contents, as well as by the manner in which they were arranged and presented to the public. The earliest museum to open among those I'm going to discuss was the Bowes Museum in Barnard Castle, County Durham, in the north of England. It opened in 1892. This collection of some 15,000 predominantly European objects was largely acquired in Paris between 1862 and 1874 by John Bowes and his French wife Josephine, with the intention of creating a purpose-built public museum in John's home county. Josephine Bowes laid the museum's foundation stone in 1869, the year of Gulbenkian's birth. The huge building was to include accommodation for her should John predecease her. In the event, neither of them lived to see the museum completed. It's administered by Durham County Council, and I think it's quite interesting. I'm mentioning who administers these museums now because I think they differ, and in the way they're administered, it's quite interesting. John thought museums should be popular and educational. The Bowes didn't have vast sums to spend on single objects, but had wide interests, and they bought many works of art. They often bought paintings by artists yet to be recognised, and the museum's collection of French paintings is the largest in Britain. Josephine was an artist, and the painting on the right is one of more than 60 paintings by her that are in the Bowes Museum. She favoured buying works by her salon contemporaries, some of whom she knew. The late 18th century English silver swan automaton on the left is the museum's most famous exhibit. But Josephine particularly formed important collections of tapestry and ceramics. She bought ceramics from factories that were, at the time, little appreciated, choosing good quality small-scale items. And the museum has over 1,500 examples of French faience and Paris porcelain from all the major centres of production. In 1861, the dealer Benjamin, now I'm not sure how to pronounce this, so you have to forgive me, Gogwe, I think, negotiated the Bowes purchase of more than 70 Spanish paintings from the collection of the Condé de Quinto, as a result of which the museum has the most important collection of Spanish paintings in Britain outside London and Glasgow. El Greco's Tears of St. Peter on the left and Goya's interior of a prison on the right are there because the Bowes took the dealer's advice when he wrote, quote, although these two do not appeal to you as masters, I think you might well take one of each of them for your collection. The Lady Lever Art Gallery was given to the nation by William Hesketh Lever, first Viscount Leverhulme, and opened in 1922. It's managed by National Museums Liverpool. Lever was born in Lancashire, the son of a grocer. In 1885, he formed Lever Brothers, which exclusively sold soap. Paternalistic, Lever built a village for his staff in Port Sunlight, near Liverpool, and later built his public gallery, the Lady Lever Art Gallery there. Construction of the gallery began in 1913, and Lever died in 1925, 3 years after the museum opened. Lever began collecting on a significant scale in the late 1880s. His purchase of Frith's painting that you see on the left, The New Frock, in 1889, marked his entry into the London art market. He based his advertisement for Sunlight soap on the painting, as you see in the middle. The purchase of Thornton Manor, that you see on the right, provided space for his growing collection. Lever was committed to creating a collection of British art with an emphasis on 18th century portraits and furniture and ceramics, as well as Victorian pictures, with a strong focus on the Pre-Raphaelites. He bought the Hill in Hampstead in London in 1904, which enabled him to present his collection in the capital to some extent. He enlarged his collection quickly by buying multiple works from single owners. So, for example, he began collecting Wedgwood ceramics in 1905 by buying the important collection assembled by the first Lord Tweedmouth. This instantly made Lever a major collector of 18th century Wedgwood. And on the left, you see Wedgwood ceramics displayed at the Hill, and then on the right, one of the pieces of Wedgwood he acquired, very important piece, he assembled an exceptionally important collection of Wedgwood Jasperware, including this copy of the ancient Roman cameo vase known as the Portland vase, which was made around 1790 by Wedgwood. Lever acquired imposing Victorian pictures from the George McCulloch sale in 1913. It was then that he decided to build a public gallery, and as his wife died shortly after he'd initiated this plan, he named the gallery in her memory. Lever placed the main emphasis of the gallery on European fine and decorative arts, with a strong holding of British art, which he'd long championed. And here you see examples from two areas of definitive importance in the gallery, Victorian painting and 18th century English furniture, as well as an English mortlake tapestry made around 1660 to 70. Keen to educate the public through art, Lever wanted to cater for all tastes, but he succeeded in creating one of the most outstanding collections of British paintings and sculpture assembled by a single collector. He was also an enthusiast for Chinese porcelain, as is evidenced by the wine cooler on the left. And in his early collecting days, he placed strong emphasis on the ethnographical collection that he was forming during his travels for business, but only a small part of that collection is actually represented in the Lady Lever Art Gallery and includes the drum that you see on the right here. Right. Kenwood House in Hampstead, North London, was bequeathed to the nation in 1927 by Edward Cecil Guinness, 1st Earl of Ivy, along with 63 Old Master and British paintings from his collection. Thus, Lord Ivy brought together a house and a collection which had no prior connection to the enrichment of both. Kenwood opened in 1928 and has been managed by the charity English Heritage since 1986. The house, renowned for its later 18th century Robert Adam interiors, was in jeopardy when Lord Ivy purchased it empty in 1925 and secured its future. It provided an excellent context for his pictures. Robert Adam had remodelled the house for William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice. Mansfield had been a bibliophile, and the library is the highlight, as you can see here, it's a wonderful room, of the Adam interiors. Lord Ivy was one of the Irish Guinness family of brewers. A multimillionaire, he began to buy pictures from the dealer Agnew in 1887. His bequest includes the most important group of Old Master paintings given to the nation in the 20th century. Among them are Rembrandt's self-portrait with 2 circles on the left and Vermeer's The Guitar Player. They hang alongside one of the finest collections of works by the foremost British artists of the Georgian era, including Gainsborough's magnificent portrait of Countess Howe on the right. Lord Ivy intended that the house and its contents should present, quote, a fine example of the artistic home of a gentleman of the 18th century. In an article in Country Life, published in 1927, the author wrote of Lord Ivy's bequest that, quote, such a gift has not been made since the bequest of the Wallace collection. In March this year, the Burrell Collection in Glasgow, Scotland, reopened after a 5-year renovation project that cost £68 million. The Burrell Collection was formed by Glaswegian shipping magnate Sir William Burrell. Sir William and Lady Burrell gave 6,000 works of art from their collection to the city of Glasgow in 1944, with provision towards the cost of a building for the museum and for expanding the collection. After a long search for a site, The museum eventually opened to the public in 1983 in a purpose-built museum in Pollok Country Park. It's run by the charity Glasgow Life on behalf of Glasgow City Council with advice from a board of trustees. Burrell collected tirelessly from the 1880s to the 1940s. He was especially enthusiastic about his huge collection of medieval works of art and sculpture. He stipulated that the collection should be, quote, shown as it would be if in a private house, so as to ensure that the building has as little of the semblance of a museum as possible. He had displayed it in this way in his home at Hutton Castle, as you see here. This slide conveys something of the range of the Burrell collection, from the works of contemporary Scottish artists such as Crawhall to that of Degas, from medieval tapestry and stained glass to Chinese and Islamic ceramics and English falconry accessories. Burrell's secretary recalled that, quote, he would often talk about his collection and in particular would compare it to the Wallace collection. He regarded his own collection as something which was intended to have an even greater impact than the Wallace. Burrell believed in the power of art to improve people's lives and wanted everyone to have access to great art. His eclectic collection was the last of its kind to be formed in Britain. Waddesdon Manor near Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, together with its collection, surrounding land and a large endowment, was bequeathed to the National Gallery by James de Rothschild, who you see on the right, in 1957. Waddesdon is a monument to James's great-uncle Ferdinand de Rothschild, its creator. It was built by Ferdinand between 1874 and 1889. Its contents epitomise Rothschild taste with its European roots in Germany and Austria and close connections with France. The Rothschild Foundation, currently led by Jacob Lord Rothschild, manages Waddesdon on behalf of the National Trust. Both Waddesdon and the Wallace collection have excellent holdings of French furniture, Sèvres porcelain, and French and Italian Renaissance decorative arts. Like the 4th Marquis of Hertford and Sir Richard Wallace, Ferdinand prized good provenances, which contributed to both collections having works of art with royal provenances. Here you don't. Here you do. Here you see the smoking room at Waddesdon, which houses an excellent group of Renaissance works of art, some of which you see on the right. Ferdinand wrote, I fear Waddesdon will share the fate of most properties whose owners have no descendants and fall into decay. Thanks to James de Rothschild, who was childless, gifting Waddesdon to the National Trust, it is today the only example of a grand mansion housing a collection embodying the 19th century Guy Rothschild that can be visited by the public. I hope this survey of 6 great British private collections that became public palaces of art has demonstrated that although their donors may have had mixed motives for founding them, we are their unequivocal beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Our next speaker is Mathieu Deldicque, who will take up his appointment next week as the new director of the Musée Condé at Chantilly. He studied at the École Nationale des Chartes and the Institut National du Patrimoine, where he was awarded a doctorate in the history of art. Between 2013 and 2015, he was curator in charge of the Musée Châteaux Nationaux, which is part of the National Museum Service. In 2015, he was appointed Conservateur du Patrimoine at the Musée Condé. At Chantilly, he has worked on the creation of a display for works on paper and for the ongoing restoration of the private apartments of the Duke and Duchess of Aumale. He has organized several exhibitions at Chantilly, including one concerning La Joconde du 2019 on the celebrated Italian charcoal drawing of the so-called nude Mona Lisa, which he was able to show reason to have been produced in the studio of Leonardo da Vinci. La Fabrique de l'Extravagance, which concern Meissen and Chantilly porcelains 2020-2021, and Albrecht Dürer, Graveur et Renaissance, which is open until 22 October this year. Everyone should take the train up to Chantilly. Today, he speaks on the transformation of the Duc d'Aumale's collections into the Musée Condé at Chantilly, des collections d'un prince au musée public, le projet du Duc d'Aumale à Chantilly.
Merci beaucoup à Amin Jaffer et à toute l'équipe de la Fondation Thani et évidemment celle de la Fondation Gulbenkian pour cette journée d'études très très riche. Je suis heureux de vous présenter Chantilly dans cette perspective d'un site, d'un château très ancien qui est devenu un musée grâce à un homme, le duc d'Aumale. Donc ce château, vous le connaissez, vous irez très rapidement, j'espère le visiter. C'est évidemment un château très français qui date du Moyen-Âge et surtout qui a été modelé par les princes de Condé, qui étaient les cousins des rois de France, de la dynastie des Bourbons-Condé. Vous avez ici le Grand Condé, vous avez ici au XVIIIe siècle Louis-Henri, premier ministre de Louis XV. Et ces princes ont façonné le site de Chantilly avec ses jardins du Indre le Nôtre, son architecture très particulière parce qu'elle est issue d'un plan médiéval, et puis les grandes écuries qui datent du XVIIIe siècle, qui ont été bâties entre 1719 et 1735 par le Premier ministre de Louis XV, Louis-Henri de Bourbon-Condé, pour abriter ses chevaux, 240 chevaux, et ses équipages de chasse. Chantilly, comme bien des châteaux français, Compiègne, Fontainebleau ou Versailles, ont été modelés pour et par la chasse. Alors ces princes de Condé ont laissé un héritage important, notamment dans les décors, avec par exemple ici la grande singerie qui a été peinte en 1737 pour le même Louis-Henri, prince de Condé, ou la petite singerie peinte en 1735 pour le même prince. Donc des princes mécènes, des princes bâtisseurs qui ont modelé ce château. Et vous avez ici un plan, un dessin du château avant la Révolution française, qui évidemment a marqué considérablement l'histoire de Chantilly. Je vais y revenir. Autre fait marquant pour Chantilly, c'est le hameau, celui qui aurait inspiré celui de Marie-Antoinette à Versailles, qui est préexistant de près d'une dizaine d'années auparavant, des petites maisonnettes qui distribuaient un appartement champêtre et dont on conserve encore 5 d'entre elles. Tout change à la Révolution française. Les princes de Condé émigrent dès le 15 juillet, le lendemain du 14 juillet. Les révolutionnaires confisquent les canons et puis vont détruire ce grand château en 1798. Il ne restera que le petit château qui est tout à gauche, dans lequel se trouvaient les appartements princiers des princes de Condé. Heureusement, ce château-là a été sauvegardé. Les princes de Condé reviennent à Chantilly en 1815, après l'Empire, récupèrent ce qu'il restait du domaine et malheureusement, la majorité de leur collection avait été confisquée, vendue ou nationalisée. C'est ainsi qu'au Louvre, à Versailles, un peu partout dans les musées internationaux, les collections des princes de Condé sont dispersées. Le dernier prince de Condé meurt en 1830, sans héritier, parce que son fils avait été fusillé sur l'ordre de Bonaparte. Et c'est ce petit garçon qui a 8 ans, Henri d'Orléans, duc d'Aumale, le 5e fils du roi Louis-Philippe, qui hérite de Chantilly. C'était le filleul du dernier prince de Condé. Et ce jeune garçon va être l'héritier le plus fortuné de France, mais il va bien utiliser cette fortune en ayant un vrai projet pour Chantilly. Alors, il avait hérité de quelques pièces des princes de Condé, comme ce meuble minéralogique offert par le roi de Suède au prince de Condé de 1774, dû à Georges Hôtel, mais c'est l'une des seules épaves de la formidable collection des princes de Condé. Donc, le duc d'Aumale va vouloir reconstituer une sorte de collection telle qu'elle aurait pu être à Chantilly. Et puis le duc d'Aumale est aussi un Orléans. Et vous savez qu'au XVIIIe siècle, la famille d'Orléans avait cette collection extraordinaire au Palais Royal, pas très loin d'ici, qui a été vendue par Philippe Égalité, notamment à Londres, chez Christie's. Et le duc d'Aumale va vouloir réparer un peu ces dispersions et recréer une collection à son image. Alors le château, lorsqu'il en hérite, il ressemble à cela. Donc il ne reste que ce petit château dans lequel il va s'installer. Il aura une première partie de carrière militaire, c'est la période de la colonisation de l'Algérie par la France, et le duc d'Aumale sera gouverneur général de l'Algérie après la prise de la Smala d'Abdelkader en 1843, qui va être un peu son fait d'armes principal, et beaucoup de souvenirs algériens, beaucoup de prises de guerre aussi algériennes, et notamment de cette Smala d'Abdelkader, demeurent toujours à Chantilly. Il a épousé une princesse napolitaine, Marie-Caroline de Bourbon-Sicile, qui est sa cousine germaine, et tous deux vont former un mariage heureux. Ils vont s'installer à Chantilly en 1845 et demander à Eugène Lamy d'aménager des appartements à la mode pour abriter leur couple et leur famille naissante. Et ces appartements ont été récemment restaurés et forment un peu le goût de la monarchie de Juillet, tel qu'on pouvait le trouver dans d'autres châteaux, comme aux Tuileries. Malheureusement, tous les autres appartements princiers ont disparu. Et c'est pour cela que ces appartements sont aujourd'hui essentiels. En 1848, le père du duc d'Aumale, le roi Louis-Philippe, est détrôné. C'est la chute de la monarchie de Juillet. Et le duc d'Aumale va partir en exil. Et ça va être un moment important dans sa vie, dans sa carrière. De 1848 à 1871, donc pendant près de 22 à 23 ans, il va être en exil à Twickenham, pas très loin à Orleans House à Twickenham, pas très loin de Londres, où il va être dépourvu de toute fonction politique et militaire, et il va pouvoir collectionner. Alors ça va être une collection progressive et qui va se former surtout grâce à la visite d'expositions comme celle de 1851 dont Suzanne parlait tout à l'heure, du Crystal Palace. Le duc d'Aumale va énormément voyager, voir des musées un peu partout et se former petit à petit à l'histoire de l'art, à l'histoire et à la bibliophilie. Donc cette famille d'Orléans, la voici ici, donc toutes ces princes exilés. Et le duc d'Aumale va se transformer en gentleman britannique qui va d'abord à Twickenham commencer à accumuler une collection progressivement grâce à un certain nombre de ventes que je vais vous exposer rapidement ici. La première vente importante, c'est la vente de son père, le roi Louis-Philippe, qui meurt en 1850. Et à la vente de Louis-Philippe en 1851, il va racheter un certain nombre de tableaux, de tapisseries, de pièces de mobilier, comme ici les deux, le déjeuner d'huîtres et le déjeuner de jambon de Lancret et Jean-François de Troyes, qui provenaient originellement de la salle à manger de Louis XV à Versailles. Ou autre pièce qui a été acquise dans cette vente du roi Louis-Philippe, c'est la commode de Riesner, de Jean-Henri Riesner, qui date de 1775, qui provient de la chambre de Louis XVI à Versailles. Autre commode importante, et ça c'est dans la même vente, de la vente du roi Louis-Philippe, c'est la commode de la chambre de Fontagneux qui était ici à l'hôtel de la Marine jusqu'à la Révolution française. Donc la première vente est familiale. La deuxième autre grande vente est familiale également, c'est la vente de 1854 du beau-père du duc d'Aumale, le prince de Salerne, qui était le père donc, de la duchesse d'Aumale, et toute une collection napolitaine, italienne, va gagner les propriétés du duc d'Aumale, et notamment ce Raphaël, que le duc d'Aumale et le prince de Salerne pensaient être une copie. En fait, il s'agit de l'original, de la Madone de Lorette, qui n'a été authentifiée qu'en 1976. Alors, en Angleterre, il est conseillé par Dominique Colnaghi, on en a parlé hier, et c'est grâce à cette relation très proche qu'un des grands fleurons de la collection en 1854, le massacre des innocents de Nicolas Poussin, va gagner les collections. Colnaghi va vendre des gravures, des dessins, des tableaux très régulièrement au duc d'Aumale, qui avait aussi plusieurs autres conseillers, comme Trichetti, qui était un sculpteur, mais aussi un conseiller artistique qui allait en maison de vente, en salle de vente pour le duc d'Aumale. Mais le duc d'Aumale choisissait aussi lui-même dans les catalogues qu'il a notés précisément et allait parfois aussi négocier lui-même, comme ce fabuleux manuscrit des très riches heures du duc de Berry qui a été acquis en 1856 à Gênes par le duc d'Aumale lui-même contre les Rothschild. Donc il y avait une émulation, une rivalité aussi pour certains de ces grands chefs-d'œuvre. Le duc d'Aumale avait l'idée à terme de faire rentrer en France les trésors qui étaient exilés comme lui. Donc il y avait un projet très intime et très personnel, et d'autant plus fort que petit à petit, tous ces enfants vont disparaître. Il a perdu 7 enfants vont mourir, sa femme va mourir aussi en exil, et donc ça va être la collection qui va devenir son enfant. On en parlait là aussi hier, de cette relation très personnelle et paternelle d'un collectionneur avec sa collection, et c'est le cas ici. Il va aussi se tourner vers les dessins. Il va être conseillé par Frédéric Rézé, qui était le conservateur du Louvre des dessins, qui avait une collection personnelle. Et en 1861, conseillé par Trichetti, il va acheter plusieurs centaines de dessins auprès de Frédéric Rézé. Alors, quelques exemples de Michel-Ange, de Dürer, de Watteau, aussi Dürer, et puis il va aussi acheter, et de Raphaël, et il va acheter aussi au cas par cas certains dessins comme la fameuse Joconde nue qui a été acquise dans ces années d'exil. En 1868, c'est la vente du marquis de Maison, grande collection là aussi, donc française, mais qu'il acquiert et qui fait venir à Twickenham, avec notamment beaucoup de certains Watteau, des tableaux orientalistes, et puis des ventes publiques, la vente de l'Essert en 1869 pour ce Raphaël qui est la Vierge de la Maison d'Orléans, qui appartenait à sa famille avant la Révolution française. Ça va être aussi les collections de Carmontel, ça va être la vente Le Noir en 1876, donc une collection qui était en Angleterre, une collection de portraits français qu'il va acquérir pour qu'elle puisse rentrer en France. À ce moment-là, le duc d'Aumale est rentré en France, donc il veut ramener en France les trésors exilés. Et puis la vente des tableaux de Frédéric Rézé en 1879 avec Fra Angelico, Sacetta, Piero di Cosimo, Ingres, notamment, et puis des ventes qui continuent, notamment en Angleterre, la vente du duc de Hamilton, qui était un grand bibliophile, qui était un proche du duc d'Aumale, auprès duquel il va acheter en 1882 notamment le bureau cartonnier de la Livre de Julie. Jusqu'à la fin de sa vie, il va continuer à collectionner, notamment ici en 1885, c'est les héritiers de Lord Dudley qui vendent les 3 grâces de Raphaël, là aussi en Angleterre, et qu'il va emporté en France pour former l'un des trésors de sa collection, et qui, on peut finir ici ce panorama très rapide avec en 1889 la collection des 366 dessins de Jean et François Clouet appartenant à la collection de Catherine de Médicis, qui était aussi en Angleterre à Castle Howard, et c'est les comtes de Carlisle qui ont vendu au duc d'Aumale cette collection. Il pensait à l'origine que c'était des Holbein, mais en fait il s'agit de la cour de France par Clouet. Donc le duc d'Aumale rentre après la chute du Second Empire en 1871, et voici le château tel qu'il le retrouve, et il a perdu tous ses enfants, je vous le rappelais, et donc il va vraiment créer un musée, reconstruire le château pour créer un musée dans l'optique de le donner à la nation française. Et voici ce château, vous le connaissez, donc avec le petit château au premier plan, qui est celui qui avait survécu, dans lequel se trouvent les appartements des princes de Condé et les appartements privés du duc d'Aumale, qui avait vraiment une aile très particulière à lui, tandis que de l'autre côté, vous avez cette architecture néo-renaissance qui ressemble à un château, mais qui est en fait un musée, dans lequel la muséographie moderne du 19e siècle a été imaginée. Donc voici le plan avec un certain nombre de galeries, certes des galeries dans lesquelles le duc d'Aumale recevait, donc c'était des lieux de vie, comme ici, donc toutes les têtes couronnées étaient reçues. On a aussi ici toutes les maisons, donc on est vraiment dans l'atmosphère de Downton Abbey à ce moment-là, qu'on essaye de reconstituer d'ailleurs. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est que le duc d'Aumale n'a pas légué tous les services, tous les linges de maison, tous les objets utilitaires. Ça, c'est parti avec ses héritiers. Pour lui, ça, ce n'était pas le musée. Et tous ces objets, en fait, nous les acquérons à nouveau pour parler de la vie quotidienne du duc d'Aumale. Par exemple, nous venons d'acheter tout le service en porcelaine de Sèvres du duc d'Aumale. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est que ce château reconstruit était aussi habité. Et donc, vous avez ici des photographies du château avant la mort du duc d'Aumale qui n'étaient pas disposées de manière muséographique. Et dans son testament, le duc d'Aumale va, salle après salle, indiquer comment présenter les collections. Donc en repoussant en mettant de côté les bibliothèques, en repoussant le mobilier sur les côtés, en faisant disparaître tout ce qui est usuel et utilitaire. Comme ici, on a toutes ces petites chaises utilitaires qui ont disparu, certains tapis aussi, pour devenir des scènes beaucoup plus... des pièces d'appartement beaucoup plus muséales, où les signes de vie du duc d'Aumale ont disparu. Évidemment, les collections de livres forment le cœur vraiment important de cette collection du duc d'Aumale, évidemment. Et puis, il a reconstruit ce château avec une muséographie destinée à créer un musée. Comme ici, vous avez la salle de la tribune pour les chefs-d'œuvre du duc d'Aumale qui s'inspirait de la tribune de la Galerie des Offices dans son architecture. Et puis la grande galerie de peinture qui formait une sorte d'architecture où l'accrochage forme lui-même une œuvre d'art. Voici quelques exemples. Et le voici, cet accrochage, qui est tout à fait pensé par le duc d'Aumale, avec le mur français et le mur italien, avec des symétries, des correspondances. Et ce qui est intéressant, comme vous le savez, c'est que ce duc d'Aumale, en 1884, a donné à l'Institut de France cette collection, une collection avec une donation sous réserve d'usufruit en 1886, et il dit, ça c'est les mots de son testament qui sont très importants, c'est qu'il veut conserver à la France le domaine de Chantilly dans toute son intégrité, avec les forêts, les bois, les pelouses, l'architecture, les livres, les archives, les objets d'art, pour former un monument complet et varié de l'art français dans toutes ses branches et de l'histoire de ma patrie à des époques de gloire. Pourquoi l'Institut de France et pas le gouvernement français? Parce que le gouvernement français l'avait exilé à 2 reprises d'ailleurs, et donc il disait qu'il pensait que l'Institut de France était un lieu qui était soustrait aux transformations des sociétés, aux secousses trop brusques, donc il voyait ça comme un gage de stabilité. Il a évidemment, comme vous le savez, assorti cette donation de conditions très strictes, selon lesquelles on ne peut pas changer l'accrochage des collections, on ne peut pas également prêter les collections en dehors du musée Condé. Ce musée, d'ailleurs, il appelait musée Condé en hommage à ses prédécesseurs, ceux dont il avait hérité. Et ce qui est, contrairement à la collection, à la Wallace Collection, on peut néanmoins acquérir et compléter la collection. Et même en termes de muséographie, on peut compléter les salles muséographiques. Donc on a quelque chose de très protecteur, mais quelque chose qui dépasse la personnalité du duc d'Aumale pour en faire une collection qui est censée être représentative de toutes les périodes de gloire de son histoire et de l'histoire de son pays. Et c'est ainsi que le musée Condé continue toujours son œuvre. Donc vous voyez, même sur la grille d'honneur, il est inscrit musée Condé, ça pourrait être le musée Aumale, mais il a bien indiqué qu'il s'agissait du musée Condé. Et donc ce testament et ce projet du duc d'Aumale est plus que jamais d'actualité, avec un projet global qui comprend 7800 hectares de terre, des édifices, les grandes écuries, le parc, l'architecture, qui a été créé pour en faire un musée, et les collections extraordinaires. Je vous remercie.
Thank you for that rich account and wonderful photographs. Our last speaker in this afternoon's third session is Meaghan Clarke. She's a professor of art history at the University of Sussex, where she has taught since 2004. Her academic interests concern issues related to British and Canadian visual and material culture, such as the role of women, taste, fashion, travel, and culture. She has served as a trustee of the Art Historians Association and acts as an external advisor for museums and universities. Past awards include a Leverhulme Special Research Fellowship and a fellowship with the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of Critical Voices, Women and Art Criticism in Britain, 1880 to 1905, first published in 2005 and in a revised edition in 2017. Her most recent book, Fashionability, Exhibition Culture and Gender Politics, Fair Women, was published in 2020. Her research projects have been supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Social Sciences and Research Council, and the British Academy, some of which have been developed as collaborative ventures with other cultural institutions, such as the National Portrait Gallery in London and the National Trust. This afternoon she speaks on women, museums, and cultural philanthropy.
Thank you so much, and thank you to, and also all of the team really at the Thani collection, as well as the Gulbenkian Museum. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and it's very generous to invite me. So I am going to we've already fortunately thought about some women involved in collecting and during this period. And I'll begin with this one. While we know a great deal about male patrons, connoisseurs, and museum directors in late 19th century Britain, the contributions of women are less well known. Yet if we turn to visual evidence, female visitors are invariably present in galleries and museums, and I show you here another Frith, we've already seen one, a private view of the Royal Academy in 1881. What were these women doing, and why were they significant for museum histories? In fact, there were many women, patrons, collectors, and cultural philanthropists, well known within the 19th century, but they've subsequently faded from view. As Kate Hill has recently observed, women collectors have been hiding in plain sight. And I show you here another example. This is private view of the Old Masters exhibition, again at the RA in 1888. So I'll consider a selection of these women and also touch on some of the challenges in tracing their legacies. In the first half of the paper, I'll consider 3 women represented in these paintings as exemplars of women's involvement in collecting in Britain. In the second section, I'll look at 3 women who might be described as scholar collectors and their involvement in professional networks and the development of public institutions in the early 20th century. And I hope these have some resonance with the Gulbenkian. Well, one reason that women were frequenting galleries during the 19th century was that they were increasingly involved in collecting art objects themselves. Therefore, they were interested in learning about different kinds of objects and in some cases developing their own house museums. They were also lending works from their own collections to temporary exhibitions, and this is an example which you see here. So these women were not merely visitors to the exhibition of Old Masters at the RA. Some of these women were collectors. And I direct you to Harriet Wantage, who's in the center beside the president of the Royal Academy, Frederick Leighton, and she's got the red shawl. Dorothy Neville, you can sort of spot in the back left corner, holding a catalogue. The first 2 women I will discuss, Harriet Wantage, who you see here on the left, and Angela Burdett Coutts, had inherited their wealth through banking and had risen to prominence as independent philanthropists and benefactors. And so you see a portrait of Wantage from 1894 there on the left. Her collection was primarily of Old Masters, amassed with her late husband. Diane Sashko MacLeod has analyzed the ways in which Victorian women found pleasure in collecting as a couple. For example, Queen Victoria herself and Prince Albert enjoyed collecting for Osborne House, as did Lady Charlotte Schreiber, whose collection was left to the V&A and the BM. And we've heard from Suzanne just now about the hidden history of Lady Wallace and her importance for the collection. So a significant number of women collected alongside their husbands, but they also operated independently, and Frances has given us some wonderful examples of that today too. And you can see this, I think, in this image in 1911 on the right, the article, it becomes Lady Wantage's collection of pictures. Indeed, Wantage, whose lifespan encompassed both the Victorian and Edwardian periods and beyond, was an important cultural figure. A wealthy benefactor with artistic priorities, she was called upon to contribute to the National Gallery's purchase of Titian's Portrait of Ariosto in 1904, and was a member of the Council for the National Art Collections Fund, which we've heard about from Jeremy. This is visually represented in this later portrait of her sitting regally in an ornate chair in a room hung with her painting collection, and hopefully you can just make a Turner in the background on the wall. And incidentally, actually, when Holbein's Christina of Denmark was saved from Uncle Sam by a mysterious female donor, Harriet Wantage's name was suggested as one possibility. Angela Burdett Coutts, who you can see in the center, turning away, in fact, from Frederick Leighton, President of the Royal Academy, was renowned for involvement in philanthropic projects, including social housing in the East End of London, as well as missionary and educational projects beyond Britain. Her own collection was diverse. It included paintings, but also jewelry and fans, both of which you can see here in this kind of extraordinary jewelry that she's wearing in the photograph, as well as the fan. In 1881, she'd married the American William Lehman Ashmead, some 3 decades her junior, to the dismay of Queen Victoria. So collecting gave a cultural dimension and legitimacy to Burdett Coutts' public persona. Readers of the Strand were taken on a private tour of Burdett Coutts' country residence at Holly Lodge at Highgate in 1894. And you can just see the boudoir in the image on the bottom. And the author reported on a residence filled with quote-unquote curios, fine art ranging from Bruegel to Frith, and portraits of eminent Victorian men, such as Dickens and the Duke of Wellington. Her collection also included some portraits of women, such as Queen Victoria, as well as Hannah More, a champion of social reform, education, and abolition. More offered an interesting example of her own philanthropy, Burdett Coutts' volume on women in philanthropy, which was published in 1893, which you see on the right, cited More. The writer and horticulturalist Dorothy Neville, who we've already seen clutching a catalogue in the back left, was a descendant of Horace Walpole, and further emphasized his collecting genealogy in 1894 by publishing an illustrated volume on Mannington Hall and the Walpoles. Although early on her husband Reginald was given credit for her collecting, she collected on her own. She had early importance as a collector of self, porcelain, and Caroline McCaffrey Howarth argues that although her early life had been tainted by scandal, collecting allowed her to reestablish her social status. Neville kept a museum-like home, Dangstein in West Sussex, which you see in the photograph, with her numerous collections of snuff boxes, ironwork, corset buttons, silhouettes, wax medallions, lockets, 18th century porcelain, and pictures. She wrote about her own collection for The Connoisseur in 1902, which you see on the left. She maintained links with South Kensington, where she was a constant visitor, and upon her death, planned to give a substantial collection of items from her estate to the museum, although many of them never made it. This one, however, did, which you can just see this box from Italy on the right. I remember the quote from this morning of Gulbenkian's spoke about the frozen austerity of South Kensington, which I found interesting, but it seems to be a site for a number of women. In the case of Wantage, Burdett Coutts and Neville, although they contributed financially to public institutions, and objects from their collections are in public institutions, such as the V&A, their collections were largely dispersed after their deaths. Now I want to turn to 3 scholar collectors. Their interests were diverse across a wide range of kinds of objects, and intriguingly, books and libraries figure in their public legacies. A contemporary of Lady Wallace was Amelia Deldicque, who wrote multiple volumes on French painting, sculpture, architecture, and decorative art, and I show you here 2 of her volumes, The Renaissance of Art in France on the left, of 1879, and on the right, French Painters of the 18th Century of 1899. She wrote the preface to the first catalogue of the Wallace collection, and the director, Claude Phillips, consulted with Deldicque as the authority on 18th century French art. She also amassed a personal collection of objects and books. The latter included books for her own work, but also fine editions of Latin and Italian classics. In this example, you see a modern volume, Walter Pater's Studies in the History of the Renaissance. She had elaborately bound and embossed with her EFSD monogram. Hopefully you could just make that out in the center there. Like Neville, Deldicque also spent considerable time at South Kensington, where she had studied, and the majority of her carefully curated and cared for collection of books now resides in the National Art Library. Her bequest serves as an intellectual and material legacy. There were other objects she gifted, including an 18th century writing case and accoutrement that had art historical and professional resonance. And visitors to the V&A can go to the William and Judith Bollinger Gallery and see an exquisite green chrysoberyl bodice ornament, an earring set made in Portugal circa 1760 she bequeathed to the collection. And we know from the files that its exhibition history was important for Deldicque, so it appeared in exhibitions in Portugal as well as at South Kensington. Incidentally, she didn't wear it as earrings. I think she wore them as brooches, so it was in pieces when it went to South Kensington. The end of Deldicque's career, she died in 1904, coincided with new developments in art collecting and art writing, and I will touch on two women involved in these. At the turn of the century, there was a renewed focus on connoisseurship, and we've already heard some about this, so this was in part due to the popularity of Giovanni Morelli. However, a boom in art publishing, notably the emergence of the Connoisseur in 1901 and the Burlington Magazine for Connoisseurs in 1903, provided a forum for debate. These developments held possibilities for women, and one of these was Christiana Herringham, perhaps best known as a founder of the National Art Collections Fund, along with the art writers Roger Fry, D.S. McCall, and Claude Phillips, who we've already heard about Fry as well, who went on to work in museums as well as writing about art. Incidentally, it was Christiana Herringham who bankrolled it, so it was her money that started it. Herringham was also present in museums and galleries intent on copying early Renaissance paintings, not as an amateur practice, but as a way of understanding technique. And you can see here an example of Herringham's copy after Botticelli's Madonna of the Book from the Pol di Pizzoli collection, which you see on the right. She also translated Cennino Cennini's book of art from the Italian, and you can see beneath her notes on medieval art methods, which document her own experiments in tempera. So in addition to working with the National Gallery collections on early Renaissance material, and in fact Dürer, and the National Art Collections Fund, Herringham had a hand in other public museums. The Whitechapel Art Gallery opened in 1901 as a publicly funded institution with a mandate of delivering free exhibitions for working people to attend. Herringham was one of its originary funders or subscribers, and was also involved in its exhibitions, one of which was the 1908 exhibition, Mohammedan Art and Life. And we've already heard wonderfully from Jessica and Judith about who are expert on the context for this exhibition. Herringham wrote the catalogue sections on Persian carpets and a series of Burlington essays entitled Oriental Carpet Patterns, which functioned as a kind of extended curatorial essay and a review of the exhibition. It is possible to decipher that several of the carpets were owned by Herringham, and the exhibition also included 9 Persian paintings from her own collection. Although these articles focused on decoration and motifs, as you can see here, and you can see these kind of detailed sketches, these are her own on the right, and the plates from the article on the left, of kind of formal qualities. But the articles also allude to contemporary concerns about the loss of objects, the movement of objects from east to west. And I quote, "England and America at the present time are draining the East of its hoarded treasures. And, except the very best and most expensive carpets, we are consuming these callously, as more durable than European manufactures." Her reference to this callous consumption implies a contrast with her own concerns with heritage and conservation. And in fact, her next project revolved around this in India. But sadly, her career was cut short due to illness. Her carpets appear to have been sold, but some of her collection and work was left to Girton College, Cambridge, while her personal library was gifted to Bedford College. The Whitechapel exhibition was, as we have heard, part of a growing interest in Persian and Islamic art. And this was also related to the expanding network of transatlantic collectors. And so finally, I'm going to turn to a woman who was to capitalize on these. While the name of Bernard Berenson is well known, his circle included several female collaborators who have recently been re-examined. And Catherine's already introduced this figure, the J.P. Morgan's first librarian and director, Belle DaCosta Green. So as we've heard, DaCosta Green's father was the first African-American graduate of Harvard College, and however, her parents separated, and the mother kind of reinvented the family as American of Portuguese descent, which is why we have the DaCosta in the name, passing as white in a segregated society. The DaCosta Green and Berenson correspondence is currently being digitized wonderfully, and it's scheduled to go live at the end of the year. And Flavinia Gennari Santori has considered the role of DaCosta Green in saving the Morgan Library and establishing herself as an authoritative voice in the field of illuminated manuscripts. By 1909, she was the de facto librarian and curator, de facto director and curator of the library, writing to Morgan that the collection should become preeminent, especially for incunabula, manuscripts, bindings, and the classics. And in 1911, she made the spectacular purchase of this rare edition of Mallory's L'Amour d'Arthur for $42,800. That year, Green also acquired this album of late 16th century Persian drawings that Hercules Reed, keeper of the British Museum, had lent to the 1910 Munich exhibition, Masterpieces of Mohammedan Art, which we've also already heard about, for Morgan. And she wrote to Reed, and I quote, "It seems to me that in a collection of manuscripts and drawings such as he has, it is very necessary for him to have a representation of this most important school." Alongside Berenson, DaCosta also began to acquire her own small collection of Islamic manuscripts, and she gifted these to the Morgan on her death in 1950. In the intervening years, she transformed the Morgan collection into a public resource, and I show you here a newspaper report of it being given to the public in 1924. So, to conclude, Victorian women collectors are often seen as frivolous or impromptu, the antithesis of a premeditated process of selection, ordering, and classification. But the histories of these women and their collections complicate these assumptions. Well, the 6 women I've touched upon collected a wide diversity of kinds of objects, and that seems to be a kind of theme of the conference. One common thread that we find in their histories is an interest in developing knowledge and expertise through collecting. This was combined with an active involvement with cultural philanthropy that was very visible within their own lifetimes, as we have seen in paintings and in the press. They were vocal advocates of sharing collections, making them accessible to the public through temporary and permanent exhibitions, educations, and through their legacies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the super contributions. I'm sure that there'll be several questions arising after this session. So who would like to ask the first one?
Thank you. Those wonderful, very thought-provoking papers. One of the questions that arose from the first two was, well, 2 things, but one was about the problem of a closed collection and how you kind of energize it. So, I mean, some of the collections that you talked about, Suzanne, are not entirely closed. You can actually buy, but there's often limitations to lending. But have you've got more experience with the Wallace. Have you got any sort of further comments to make about that, about this problem of the closed collection?
Yeah, and I think it's the only one I spoke about that's closed, the Wallace.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I don't see it as a problem. I suppose it's because the collection is such an outstanding collection. But I personally find it sort of fascinating to find out about the individual. There were 5 contributors to the collection, if you don't include Lady Wallace, who is responsible, as far as we know, for one painting being in it. It's very, very interesting to look at it from the point of view of the individual collectors and what they contributed. And I think because of the range and quality of the collection, it doesn't strike me as an issue, and in fact has certain aspects that I think are quite an advantage.
Is it the same with the Chantilly collection? Because I think you mentioned, did you, that it...
In Chantilly, we can buy. The Duc-d'Aumale has a very strict will, but he didn't forbid us to increase the collection. Obviously, we are not supposed to. We can't buy a fourth Raphael or something like that. But in his testament, in his will, he said that we can increase the collection, and we can, in certain part of the chateau, we can create new galleries. And that's what we've done 5 years ago when we created the new prints and drawing galleries. Actually, the Duc-d'Aumale imagined that.
I should add that we can add objects and documents that are relevant to the history of the collection and the founders. So I think we're easing up a bit, but they shouldn't really be displayed with the collection itself. But they go into something called the Hertford House Historic Collection. So, for example, there are a couple of works of art in the collection that were part of what came in, object that came into the collection. And so the National Art Collection Fund, which in fact initially met at the Wallace collection, in one case, through them, we were able to purchase a lunette to go over a painting that had been separated from. So, we're just in the process of acquiring a second individual photograph of the 4th Marquess of Hertford just on his own that we've come across, which a colleague found on eBay a couple of weeks ago. So that will go into the Hertford House Historic Collection. So that is a way of bringing relevant objects and documentation into the collection.
Can I just say that Meaghan can also contribute? Did any of the women that you talked about, did they give funding as well as objects to the collections? Because that's another way of expanding it, the collection, and kind of getting your name known.
Well, indirectly, I suppose, through what's called the Art Fund. So they did contribute certainly to the Art Fund, and Herringham also gave funds to other things like the Whitechapel, although not for buying objects. That was for loan collections that were shown at the Whitechapel. So I suppose, it's indirect rather than a direct amount. That's a kind of legacy, I think, in their cases,
Si je peux ajouter quelque chose, il faut qu'on parle aussi de Nelly Jacquemart-André, qui est vraiment proche de certaines grandes collectionneuses que Suzanne à Barnes Collection, qui était une grande artiste, qui est une grande collectionneuse aussi en France, et qui, elle, aussi, comme le Duc-d'Aumale, a donné à l'Institut de France. Donc on a vraiment des liens entre collectionneurs de part et d'autre de la Manche. Richard Wallace a été très important pour tout cela, le Duc-d'Aumale en France aussi, et les E2 correspondaient. Et puis, ils ont formé des sortes de modèles, et notamment pour des femmes, et comme Nelly Jacquemart.
Thank you very much for 3 terrific papers. My question is for Meaghan, so don't give that microphone away. One of the things I'm very interested in is the role of gatekeepers in art worlds, and that's particularly acute in the contemporary art world. And one of the things I've been looking at is whether female art dealers have more diverse rosters than their male counterparts. The answer seems to be no. So my question to you is there anything distinctive about what the women are collecting? Is it simply that they're there and active and visible that's the interesting point, or are they collecting differently?
Good question, really good question, and thank you. And I suppose just two things. One, off the top of my head, that they're called gatekeepers within the period. So one of the reviews of the Fair Women exhibition I worked on, which was 1894, in the press, they're talked about as, it's interesting because it's run by a committee of women. It's, it's an exhibition that's curated by a committee of women or organized by a committee of women, and they're called gatekeepers in the press. So that is a phrase that's used within the period. In terms of what they collect, I suppose there is an idea that what women collect, and some scholars have argued this, is because of their interest in femininity and interiors and decoration and design, that they're collecting certain kinds of objects, and they have certain relationships with them, which are more about this kind of personal relationship, intimate relationship with objects. But actually, I would disagree with that. I think in some cases that's true, but I wouldn't make that kind of generalization, because I think you're right. Some are collecting for the same reasons that perhaps male counterparts are collecting. And certainly of the ones I've mentioned, they're collecting a wide range of kinds of objects. Some are collecting jewelry, but some are collecting jewelry alongside, other kinds of work that might be considered masculine, I suppose, in its, whether it be an old master or something like that. So I think that that's not true. And it's also not true because some of the discourse, the debate about connoisseurship and scientific connoisseurship, which is, a phrase that we're thinking about, is actually set by women. So Herringham, is going into the National Gallery and saying, that's not a tempera, this is a tempera. So she's one of the early people to think about what we call technical art history, so that aspect of scientific analysis of medium and technique. So I think, yeah.
And if I can just add to that, because it's an idea that carries forward into the avant-garde as well. You think of the Cohn sisters collecting Matisse. They collect a lot of his Nice period works. And you've got the Museum of Modern Art collecting all of the earlier stuff, the things that are deemed to be macho and really intellectual or whatever, and it's a way of denigrating what the Cohn sisters were doing. So that sort of gendered attitude to collecting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Given that
Herringham. Yeah.
Given that Lady Herringham was such an important figure in the foundation of the National Art Collections Fund, I just wondered whether you might speculate as to whether she could have been the mysterious English lady in a German watering place who gave the £40,000 to the National Art Collections Fund at the last minute in order to save the Holbein Christina, Duchess of Milan. There's been quite a lot of speculation about this, mainly by sort of in feminist literature, but none of it based very much on much in the way of fact. And one candidate which was suggested was Lady Carlisle, and certainly the Carlisles were not wanting to contribute £40,000 to the sale to save a Holbein in 1909, because that's precisely the year that they sold the Van Dyck portrait of Franz Sneijder's. They were short of money, and another I think idea was that it might have been Consuela Vanderbilt, but since she was American, she was hardly an English lady in a German watering place. So, I mean, you probably don't want to stick your neck out and contribute to this speculation, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really interesting question. I'd love to know. I mean, if you know, if anybody knows, it would be
well,
fascinating to know. Wantage was suggested as well.
Yeah.
Herringham is certainly a possibility. But I suppose what makes me think possibly not with Herringham is that by that point, I talked about the exhibition that she was involved in Whitechapel, at the Whitechapel in 1908. So she was interested in Persian and Islamic art and collecting. She collects quite a wide diversity of stuff. But she's also spending time in India during that period. So she's also interested in heritage, really, in that context. And at the same time, she is also becoming really involved in suffrage and the suffrage movement, and is contributing to that, the Artist Suffrage League, and making banners and getting silk from India, in fact, for the banners. So she's got so many things that she's doing that I don't know if she would have been doing that, because she was quite preoccupied with her other projects. But maybe it's possible. She certainly was there and had money.
Well, we'll probably never know, because for
Yeah.
those of you who don't know, the identity is in a sealed envelope,
Yeah.
which is in the archive of the National Art Collections Fund, and that envelope is passed from director to director. And so unless somebody steams open the envelope, we won't know.
I vote for steaming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other speakers?
Meaghan, I'm just fascinated by this black Portuguese collector of Islamic art. I mean, this is just an incredible find, just an amazing story. Do you know anything about her manuscripts and the things that she bought? Are they interesting? Are they illustrated? Are they more calligraphy oriented? Can you share anything? Thank you.
Well, really, it's your expertise that I would hope to sit and look at them and learn more about them, really. I only know about them in terms of they've been catalogued, so you can see which ones because she worked right up until 1948, and then she dies in 1950, so she gives those things are handed over at that point. So it is recorded which items are part of that kind of small collection. But it seems to be something that she's doing with Berenson. She had a relationship with Berenson. And so it's hoped that once this correspondence is digitized and transcribed, that maybe we'll learn a bit more about the specifics of that kind of collecting that they're doing in parallel, really, I suppose, in and around that period.
I just want to say that these nuances are so important for us to bring out all these nuances and not to go for such black and white interpretations, big interpretations of things. Gulbenkian, just very quickly, it's very clear that he had help, as John Conlon has explained well, in terms of his painting collection, especially from others. But when I've looked at the Islamic collection, that's not the case. I mean, there's only one instance I can find any letter in which it's clear that somebody is actually telling him what to do, and then he goes ahead and does it. So it's more a nuanced picture than just as simple as that. And the same thing just to say about Berenson, because Berenson decides that Gulbenkian must be somebody who wants to buy Armenian manuscripts. And so he just assumes that and writes to him, I've got an Armenian manuscript, would you like to buy it? And he writes back and says, I am an Oriental collector. I collect Persian manuscripts. So you see, it's important to really dig, also as Vera has been doing in finding new material, dig deep in the archives, also as Jonathan has done, and to read some of these things and to question whether or not sometimes we tend to want to put things inside boxes because it's easier for us also as historians and as art historians.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Could I just add to that I think that when one goes to the Morgan Library, that we were speaking yesterday about Mr. Gulbenkian always being referred to in a very formal way. It was Mr. Gulbenkian, Mr. Morgan, and I think Belle de Costa Green is referred to still in that institution with a full formal name. She was obviously a remarkable and formidable woman. Any other? Yes.
Can I just, this isn't a question really, but following up from Mathieu's excellent talk, just wanted to flag up, if anybody's interested, that, and I told Mathieu this already last night, that we have a fascinating album of material to do with the House of Orléans, which is in the Cornavy archive, which is now housed out at Watson Manor. And anybody who'd like to go and have a look at it, just make an appointment with the archivist.
And we also have another album which contains quite a few letters, not in the same album, which relate to the time when the Duc d'Aumale was in England, a period when Dominic Colnaghi was acting as a curator for his collection, and there's records of him showing the collection to visitors at Orleans House, and doing framing and repairing things. So he, apart from selling that wonderful Poussin, Massacre of the Innocents, he was acting as a sort of curator for the Duc d'Aumale in exile in England. And then you mentioned the Clouet drawings, those were which came from Castle Howard. That deal was brokered by the two young, well, actually one of them was young, the other one's not so young, partners who joined the firm in 1894. One being my great hero, Otto Guttekunst, and the other being Edmond Desprez, who was French, and Guttekunst dealt with Lord Carlisle, and Desprez dealt with the Duc d'Aumale, and they're there at Chantilly. And there's a lot of Mathieu's predecessor, Nicolas Garnier, said there's a lot of material relating to Colnaghi, which I've never actually had time to go and look at, but
You're totally right, and there's lots of things to do still. And we just purchased a few months ago new archives of one of the executor of the testament, of the will of the Duc d'Aumale, with new material about the British period of the Duc d'Aumale and the purchase, and especially also the connections between him and other British collectors who came to Orleans House to visit him. The connection with the royal family also. Prince Albert was very important for the Duc d'Aumale. He was a collector also of photographs, 19th century photographs like Albert. So yes, there's lots of work to do. Yeah.
Correspondence with the Prince Albert's librarian about photographs, which I came across fairly recently, which connect with Albert's big project, which used photographic archive to do Raphael. And I think the Duc d'Aumale was interested in that content.
And all the Raphael of the Duc d'Aumale were photographs for Prince Albert, yes.
And Nicole Garnier, many years ago, showed me into this very secret part of your wonderful chateau, where the private part where there are some English 18th century chimney pieces by John Linnell, which came from Orleans House, which is rather interesting, and a pair of lead dogs. I can't remember who those are by. John Nost or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway.
Fine. You have to come again.
Yeah.
Exactly. Strong connections.
Any more questions? Yeah, yes.
Are you familiar with any of these women that were not collectors, were not all the example that you gave us, but who were curators for private collectors who were men? Because the curator of Gulbenkian collection was a woman. So it's I have no idea if you have. There are many cases of women who were collectors of private collections run or owned by men.
That's a really good question, and that's probably a project that needs to be done, is connecting up. I mean, Belle de Costa Green fits in that category very neatly, doesn't she? So yes, I think there are probably a number we could, if we sat and tried to add them up.
Her background, she had information in when she first started working for him.
No, she sort of made her career by doing that. Yeah.
Because you have a feeling regarding Marcel Chanel, which was the curator of Gulbenkian's collection, that she was hired for her secretarial skills, for her skills for organization and systematization and all that. And then she learned by doing, and of course then she went to École du Louvre. But in the beginning there's that sense, and if we go back to Gulbenkian earlier years, we see that he has his secretaries doing that work of cataloging and inventory, which is sort of organization, because he kept everything, all the invoices and all that, so they were just using that information to make the records in the catalog.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, Kate Hill's worked on women in museums in the 19th century in Britain, and she's found interesting records in public institutions, thinking about how women operated as cleaners, often, as that sort of thing, and then maybe would be doing other sorts of things in the museum. But certainly those on the payroll were usually limited to those kinds of activities, not the directors.
If I can add something about women curating for a collector in Chantilly, maybe the curator of the Duc d'Aumale was his mistress, Berthe de Clinchamp. She was the last companion, maybe wife, we don't know, but a close friend of the Duc d'Aumale. And she was a kind of secretary, and she cataloged it. She has cataloged the collection, one of the first, yes.
Had some sort of roles similar to
Yeah. It's a common phenomenon.
I tell you who was very, I kind of forgot the figure's Frick's daughter.
Yeah.
She she's not a catalogue collection, also curator. So she's an example. Yeah.
Dorothy de Rothschild as well, sorry, yes. The sister of Ferdinand. Alice. Dorothy was the widow of James, but then it had already gone to the National Trust. So, yes, Alice. And then Lady Wallace, of course. I mean, one doesn't envisage her as a curator, but, I mean, she was looking after the collection between 1890, when Wallace died, and when she died in 1897. So, yeah, slightly different, yeah.
Well, thank you all for a very rich and full and stimulating session. Thank you.